Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Scott Sturt, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, and your host. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and young Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 2, we'll be chatting with young Canadians about their unconventional career trajectories and what it's like to be young entrepreneurial leaders. I'm excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. Zameer Masjedee is the guest on this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Zameer was born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario, where he studied software engineering at Carleton University. During his time there, Zameer was involved with everything from Greek life to student politics, where he served as the president of the Carleton University Students Association. Zameer currently lives in Vancouver, spending his days working as a senior solutions engineer at Canada's very own Shopify, helping merchants of all sizes bring their e-commerce streams to fruition. His love for all things podcasts sparked his moonlighting journey as co-founder of LISN, a platform aimed at improving the content discoverability and creator growth challenges in the industry. When he's not absorbed in tech, you can find him skiing or hiking the West Coast terrain that he's grown so fond of. Zameer, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Scott. It's a beautiful day in Vancouver, sun shining. Really can't complain.
Glad to hear that you are doing well this afternoon, and Vancouver is so beautiful, especially this time of year. I believe the cherry blossoms are beginning to bloom, much nicer than Toronto or most of Ontario. So I just want to start the kind of conversation talking a little bit about your experience as the student government president at Carleton University. Can you tell us about how your experience in student leadership influenced your entrepreneurial journey thus far?
Yeah, absolutely. I was a executive with CUSA for 2 years. My first year, I was a vice president student life or vice president external, so a lot of programming oriented stuff. And then in my second term, I was lucky enough to serve as the president. And it was definitely a challenge. I think it was one of those things where going into it, there's a lot that you set out to do from like goals perspective and all of these other things. And inevitably, because anything that's related kind of to a large organization of that scale, it's like a $2.1 million nonprofit with like full-time staff and students, employees, and all these things, becomes a lot of like management work from like a project perspective, from a people perspective. And going through that over the course of 2 years, I think one of the things personally that it helped me identify was that I didn't want to be a developer like 40 hours a week. The work that we got to do that was more like project driven was really exciting to me. And so being able to work with like a team of individuals at CUSA, some awesome people that are doing some really great things now, really taught me that I enjoy like the leadership aspect of various roles, even though honestly, just candidly wasn't that great at it at the time and still a lot that I'm trying to learn. But it was something that made me realize that there's more to just the heads down development that otherwise I think as a software engineering student, you typically find yourself pursuing. Part of that also was just because Carleton is like a pretty entrepreneurial university. We have this entrepreneurship program called Hatch, which allows students to effectively take their idea from their business from idea, incubate it all the way to a company. And from there, we got to see a lot of like students actually doing it, right? There's a couple of students there that currently run a business called Hopier. It used to be Desk Nibbles, that kind of is like the student snacking space, another VFC partner. And a lot of these things just started off as like ideas within the school, and you watch them be able to manage that alongside their studies, turn it into something that's now a very successful company. And all of that's really inspiring. So I think being a part of that community, being a part of Carleton University Student Association and like supporting those initiatives made you realize that, hey, this is a lot of fun and I'd love to get involved with it in like a more in-depth capacity once things are all done and said and done with school. So yeah, it was great.
Speaking about your kind of lessons learned and how you grew as a leader, what were some of those main lessons, and what were, if you were to reflect back on the experience, what were some of the biggest mistakes you made, and what did you learn from those mistakes?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones really is have the tough conversations. I think it's easy to just put those aside at times because they're difficult and they're uncomfortable. And sometimes you don't realize ultimately the impact of not having them, what that will do to the overall team or the overall project. but it's important to address things that are otherwise just kind of like going to inevitably be challenges, right? Like you're always going to face difficult times with team members or with various organizations that you're a part of. And if you're able to like chat through those with the people because you've established like a high level of trust, that's super, super important. And I think that's something I definitely could have done better during my time there, is had more of those hard conversations up front and helped people through challenging times. And that's something that I try to like take into the work that we're doing now with LISN and inevitable challenges that are coming up, just keeping that in mind as well, because it definitely was one of those lessons that now that I do plan to and kind of like execute on some of those conversations, you can immediately feel the benefit of almost like the relief that, okay, we got this out of the way. Now let's attack the main issue, which is like the problem at hand that we're both facing. So yeah, I think that was a big takeaway that resonated with me for sure.
Someone's success is correlated with their ability to have difficult conversations in life. And I've heard that many times, and it is definitely true. The difficult conversations are essential, and if you just keep on pushing them off, you're going to end up having to deal with it at some point. So at some point, it just makes sense to rip the band-aid off. I have some experience my own self with student government kind of leadership, and then also student government election campaigns. And I know election campaigns for student government can be quite the intricate kind of experience. So can you tell our listeners, what was your, at a nutshell, what was your election strategy? How did you end up getting elected? What were the kind of lessons learned from that whole experience of running an election campaign?
Oh boy, where do I start? I think it was probably to date still one of the hardest things I've ever done. If you just consider all of the preparation that goes into it before the actual campaign starts, in terms of just like mass absorption of information about everything that's like all the different student issues that are on campus and everything about the organization, and just like this really rigorous preparation time that spans a couple of weeks where you and your team are just trying to learn as much as you can so you can form a platform of value to the student body. Like that is a very crucial component. And then there was the execution come campaign time, and like being able to actually take this message and platform that you've established and like disseminate to the student body. And that's just hours on the ground, right? So it was like we would start every day 8 a.m. Because the first classes were at 8:30, and we wanted to be able to interact with students on their way to class. And then we would end every day at 10:30 p.m. because classes went till 10, and we wanted to interact with all those students as they went home, and kind of did that for a span of 2 weeks. And I feel like a lot of listeners might be able to resonate with this as well. If you're on like merchant calls or sales calls a lot as part of your role, like sometimes you are in a more casual conversational mode where you're just chatting with like people that you know and friends. And other times like you're on, right? Like you are on the ball, you're presenting this message, you want to make sure that it comes across well. And that's exhausting over a long period of time, right? If you've like in back to back, like 4 different sales calls or demo calls, when you're done the 4th one, you're like, I'm turning my camera off. I'm going to go take a little break. And so it was like that for 12-hour duration. And so that was pretty challenging, but honestly, it was ultimately what let us talk to the largest number of students via different class talks and everything like that. And a lot of value came out of it, right? Like hearing individual perspectives on some of these ideas that we'd otherwise ourselves just kind of try to generalize and present. So it's a lot of work. I was lucky enough that both of those campaigns were successful, but from a takeaway, anyone looking to do it, you grow so much during the process, but it's rigorous. So prepare for it, and ultimately, like you take a lot away from it. It's super valuable.
It's a super rigorous process. All the while, you're also managing your studies, all your classes, all these other things. What lessons did you learn from the experience, in particular, as relates to time management? Because I know it is like working 2 different jobs in essence when you're doing something like that.
It is. It is. And I don't know if I'm the best to speak about this, because when it came to like academic priorities, mine were kind of not so existent. Like I think when I was reaching my last year of university, so it took me 6 years to complete my undergrad. I was in a co-op program. I was supposed to complete it in 5 years. And then I chose to ultimately leave my co-op program and then stick around for another year as well to do 2 years of student politics. Towards the end of it, I got pretty sick of school. I think part of it was because as a software engineering student, I was kind of seeing like what was being taught in class and how I felt that applied to the actual industry that I was also very involved in terms of just monitoring what's up and coming technology and how some of these different startups and companies are using this technology within what they're building. And I thought there's like a disconnect there. I thought the stuff that we were learning at school, I couldn't really understand how it was going to transfer over to help me be impactful in my role going forward. And so I was kind of strategic about how I spent my time, right? And towards the end of university, candidly for me at least, it was like, I'm just trying to get the most of this overall experience. And academically, that was just passing my classes and getting through that particular degree, because I was getting so much more out of the other elements of extracurriculars that I was investing my time in, right? I could see myself growing leadership capabilities and project management capabilities and other things that I felt would better help me be successful in future roles that I wanted to take on. So I think for other individuals, it just comes down to understanding, like, being really cognizant of the value you are getting out of some of these different courses, and like allocating your time accordingly, because that doesn't necessarily mean you show up to every single class and do every single assignment, because the other things you could do with your time could also be equally valuable for you and where you want to end up. So just be cognizant of all that when you're taking a look at it.
That resonates a lot with my own personal experience, and I often made that trade-off where I'd say I'm going to spend more time on extracurricular activities or internships because that aligns more with my career goals and what I actually want to learn than if I just spent another 30% studying for this course to get that much better. You're a software engineer by background, or you work as a software engineer and you studied software engineering in school. If you were talking to a 17, 18-year-old who is looking to break into software engineering as a full-time job, would you recommend that they go to university?
Great question. So, small little caveat first, that I'm not actually a software engineer at Shopify. So I'm a solutions engineer at Shopify. And I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what that is, because for me, leaving university, I didn't know this career existed. And when I did, it was a very pleasant surprise, because it lives in the intersection of things that I particularly enjoy. And before I knew about it, didn't necessarily know I could get into as a full-time career. So the concept of solutions engineering, or in some companies, it's called pre-sales engineering, is really allowing you as an individual to act as like a product or technical consultant for merchants that are exploring your product to determine if you can meet their requirements, and if not, like, how creatively can we establish workarounds that allow us to kind of get there and ensure that they can do everything that they want to do from a business perspective. So within Shopify today, that's kind of like 50% sales, where we are doing all of the standard sales stuff in terms of product positioning and like roadmap stuff and everything else that comes into that particular conversation. But it's also very much so like understanding enough about Shopify as a product and e-commerce as an industry, that when we jump on these conversations, we're not so much like that sales guy or gal. We are the technical consultant that's going to give them really objective information about how to succeed. And so you get to, at the same time, kind of flex all of your technical experience and interests, while also all of your relationship building and communication abilities as well. And I think that's interesting for people that might not necessarily like sometimes the isolation that comes with otherwise very tech heavy jobs, and prefer also like the social elements of doing something more conversational, more externally oriented. So solutions engineering is great. And whether it's at Shopify or other companies, I'd highly recommend people to just look into it, because there's a lot that you can learn and develop within that particular field. But to go back to your question, as a software engineer, because I definitely do a lot of software development, particularly when it comes to my startup, LISN. Do you need to have a background, a formal education for that? When I went to university at Carleton, I had like zero coding experience. Like, I think that's more the norm than it isn't, especially back in the day. Now there's some programs that high schools adopt, so people get a little bit of familiarity into them. But when I started working on LISN, it wasn't really like, the first thing that I did is I took a $20 Udemy course on how to build apps with Flutter, which is the framework that we use. Is powered by Google, lets you write code once, run it like on 5 different platforms, which is awesome. But I learned more from like a practical applicability perspective in that course than I did in like a significant amount of my software engineering courses, because it was real-time learning. It was me trying to take these concepts that I was interested in the moment and apply them to a problem that I was equally interested in to the moment. And then I retained it. And then I really understood it. And I was interested enough in it that I could like further my knowledge on that topic and ultimately leave that entire experience with like this product. And so if there are other people that are interested in like software development or building something, really, like, there's courses out there like this $20 Udemy course that I'm citing that starts off assuming you have no background in computer programming. And obviously it might take a little bit more for you to get there in terms of rewatching certain lectures or whatever else might be involved, but you'll get there if you have the persistence to do it. And so I don't think university or post-secondary or whatever the formal state of education is should be a barrier to anyone trying to pursue a career in technology or as a developer, because there's so much great resources out there that you could look into if you have the determination to kind of stick with it on your own.
Yeah, there are many different paths to becoming, I think, a software engineer. And for certain people, going through traditional university, some people can be completely self-taught. There's coding boot camps. There's to each their own in that journey. In terms of LISN, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your startup? What's your mission? What motivated you to launch the company, and what excites you so much about the opportunity?
Yeah, I would love to chat about this. So LISN is a platform that allows you to create, share, and discover podcast clips. So podcasting is going through like a really exponential growth right now, right? Like less than a week ago, March 24th, we broke the 2 million podcast threshold on Apple Podcasts. So now there's more than 2 million active shows on there. And amongst them, there's 47 million episodes, which kind of begs the question, where do I start as a user and how do I stand out as a creator, right? And so what we're really trying to do is we're trying to allow creators and users to kind of like repurpose existing content to make it more discoverable and to make it easier to share. And I was kind of noticing on the VFC podcast on LinkedIn, you folks kind of do this yourselves, right? Like you had a conversation with Ben Wynn, took a couple 30-second snippets of it. We're able to share that on socials to give people an idea of what to expect from that long format conversation. And that's half of what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it easier for creators to be able to present their ideas to people in a way that they're willing to approach, that reduces that barrier of entry that otherwise like long format conversations have, right? Like you and I are chatting here now, might be a conversation over 30 minutes. I could kind of send that to 10 people. And the only one that I'd be confident is actually going to listen to it is probably my mom. And so if we can, aside from that, create it, make it a way that is going to make it easier for those people to engage in those conversations, then we find that it's going to actually help those creators grow their audience. Part of that comes down to the fact that podcasts, in a standard podcast conversation like you and I are having right now, just talk about so much. There's so many different topics that are involved in an authentic, normal conversational style episode. And not everyone might be interested in every topic of discussion, but the medium forces you to consume that way right now. Right. And I think we could take a look at someone like Joe Rogan as a prime example of this, simply because his episodes are so long. And the only information or insight you get going into an episode is the name of the guest. And so how do you know what they're talking about without actually kind of jumping in, moving around? And he did this already himself on YouTube. Before then, all the exclusivity with Spotify is that he had his main channel where he was posting his 3-hour-long conversations. And then he had a clips channel where he was taking that 3-hour-long conversation, he was cutting it up into segments of anywhere from 5 minutes to 20 minutes. There'd be like a dozen of them that he'd get from a show. And when we began to analyze some of the numbers to understand why he was doing this, what was the value there for him as a creator, we noticed that some of those clipped versions of the same content were getting upwards of 700% more views. And so there's definitely something there where users can anticipate what to expect from a conversation, making them more likely to want to engage in that conversation. And we think that's basically a benefit we want to add to all creators. So that's something that we're really focused on. We think clips is going to be a really cool mechanism to do that. And another piece of that as well is like from the user side, we can now allow you to listen to conversations or listen to ideas topic by topic. So imagine you're really interested in entrepreneurship, but I didn't want one particular show's take on entrepreneurship. I don't want one particular guest's take on entrepreneurship. I want a diverse set of takes on entrepreneurship so that I can form my own educated perspective on the topic. Well, if we're able to clip up all of these different episodes and just pull out the segments related to a topic like entrepreneurship, then we can group it together in this, what we're calling a conversation. And now you can start consuming by topic. And you're going from perspective A to B to C, all on this thing you're interested in. And you leave feeling a lot more educated on the topic and a lot more prepared to kind of form your own opinion on something, which kind of goes against the entire echo chamber issue that other social platforms face. So long-winded answer, but in a nutshell, those are really the two things that excite us the most about being able to repurpose the medium. And yeah, it's going really well so far.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something. And there's, as someone who also likes listening to a lot of podcasts, I often find that challenge of, uh, let's say we were talking about Tim Ferriss's interviews beforehand, is that he has some of his interviews are 3 hours long, and these really really long interviews where there's sometimes maybe only maybe 45 minutes or an hour of it that I want to listen to, because 3 hours is that's like watching like a double feature movie. I think it's great to empower creators so that they can, in essence, connect their listeners more with specific kind of segments. I guess one question I have for you, Zameer, is and I saw you post something on LinkedIn about this in terms of kind of with Listen and dealing with the Apple Store and how to some of the regulatory kind of challenges. Can you walk through listeners kind of about some of the regulatory challenges you face in this space and kind of what's your challenge or what's your plan to potentially overcome them?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this story because it kind of blew me away in terms of the order of operations and how everything ultimately panned out. So, um, just to fill folks in, we were done building our product or getting it to that MVP stage, and we're ready to submit it to the App Store. And we went through the overall submission process where you provide all the metadata for your application and all of the screenshots and everything you need, and then you just send it over for Apple to review, test out, and you're pretty much typically good to go. Now, what ended up happening was we got rejected for that first application, citing a guideline from the App Store that said, hey, I think it was like 522 copyright guideline that you're redistributing audio and video content without permission. And from our perspective, it was interesting because we didn't really believe we were doing anything outside of the norm of other podcast apps. There's actually an entire segment of applications that have a specific name that effectively like play podcast content the same way we do. It's called podcatchers. So for a creator, when you're launching your show, you might go and register it with the big players. You go register with Spotify, you register with Apple. Everybody else effectively just kind of like listens to see what happens in their databases, and they pull in those shows into their app as well. So we're doing something pretty similar. When it came to clips, really what we're allowing people to do is identify like within this episode, when's it that this good part or your specific segment that you're interested in starts, fast forward you to that spot, and then end it when that conversation or topic is done. So that's kind of how it was working under the hood. And the feedback we got from Apple was that, hey, no, unfortunately, this counts as modifying and redistributing third-party content. So they actually asked us to get explicit permission from every single creator that we wanted to allow clips to be generated for, which candidly is infeasible. There's just no way that we could get permission from every single creator that we want to have on the platform. So we went back and forth with Apple a couple times. They're very adamant in their stance. We actually got on the phone, talked to some legal representatives, and they effectively told us that you can either go through like a formal legal review process or you could change your business. And at that stage is kind of when I made a LinkedIn post soliciting help, really getting ideas from the community on how can we go about tackling this. And we were fully prepared to kind of put down a full like legal appeal with all the associated information that we need, but lengthy process that we didn't really want to engage in. And 24 hours after I made that LinkedIn post, my co-founder calls me on FaceTime and he's like, did you see the email that we got? And I'm like, no, what are you talking about? And I pull up my inbox and it says that your app went from rejected to in review. And then 3 minutes later, your app is now ready for the App Store. So without us actually needing to do anything or change our idea or go through this lengthy legal review process, they just had it looked at again. And we ended up getting approved. So they must have said that, hey, these things are a lot more standard than they had expected. What effectively caused them to look at that again? I have no idea. I hope one day I'm able to determine if it was like someone on LinkedIn seeing it or if it was that conversation we had with the legal representatives at Apple. But it's one of those things where if Apple takes a stance against you, it's typically pretty hard to budge, right? Fortnite wasn't able to do it and all of these different things. And so we were really lucky in that effort. But it does just show you that there's all of these unexpected barriers that come up from trying to launch a company. And it's just a matter of knocking down like one hurdle after the next until you ultimately get to where you want to go. And what felt existential for us at the time ended up working out pretty well. So we're really happy with that. And that was just a funny story to look back on.
I agree. One of many struggles along the road, and I think it's a great example of a challenge that kind of facing in this specific time in your journey. So the podcast sector, as you mentioned, is huge. Like there's 47 million different podcast episodes on in Apple Podcasts, and that's a huge amount. And there's so many people, including with Venture Canada. We recently launched this podcast. What do you think makes a podcaster really stand out, and who are your favorite podcasters, and why do you specifically love them?
Yeah. I think there's like this tough to quantify at times attribute to certain podcasts, which really is just like the level of care that goes into them that you can, as a user, feel, right? And I'm going to give a couple examples here. I think one of them, fellow VFC fellow, is David Oladejo, who launched his podcast, Life IQ podcast, where he's having conversations with entrepreneurial folks about different life questions that you might have. And it's just a matter of like taking the time to put in that extra level of production where you're kind of formatting it well with like different sections. You have like audio accompanying it, and really well thoughtfully laid out conversation that people enjoy listening to, right? And that's on the small scale. He just launched kind of 2 weeks ago. On the other side of that also is there's this other podcast, which I love to plug whenever I can. It's called Dissect by Cole Kuchna. And it's outside the norm of like, I think the standard podcast that I listen to. It's a long format audio analysis of some various, very, I would say, pivotal albums of our generation. And he analyzes the stories behind like the artists and the songs themselves. And so I think more and more people are kind of using podcasts as both like an educational tool, but also like this creative outlet. And when you get to see like the fruits of people's labors that are really passionate about various topics, like that's super energizing, right? And I think I love being able to engage with that kind of content, aside from all the standard stuff that I really enjoy too, like the interview style conversational elements. But I think that's one of those things where, as various companies that have been acquired continue to do well, like Wondery just got acquired from exclusive rights and so on and so forth, the level of podcast production is definitely being appreciated. And so it's one of those things that stands out for people that are kind of launching their own and finding ways to potentially differentiate from the crowd.
And it is such a challenge to differentiate from the crowd. My own experience with Venture for Canada and launching this podcast is that there are literally probably a million entrepreneurship podcasts out there. And one of our strategies with this podcast is really focusing on specifically telling the stories of Venture for Canada fellow alumni, and focusing on that as a specific kind of audience. And I share that just more for people listening. If you're looking to launch a podcast or you're considering one tip is to potentially really focus on a specific niche audience or a specific group of people initially who have a high likelihood to want to listen. Because if your focus is too broad, there's so many podcasts out there, it's really hard to break through the noise.
Yeah. That's just standard. That's really good standard business advice too. You always want to start off with like a niche where they have your problem or are interested in your topic, and then kind of work outwards from there. And I think you folks are doing a great job of that with this podcast as well.
Thanks. In terms of your experience at Shopify, so you've been at Shopify for a couple of years, and you said you're looking to go full-time with LISN. What are some of the lessons you've learned from working at Shopify, in particular in the sense of Shopify is the most successful, the most valuable company in the country. It is an incredible success story and is often said to have a very entrepreneurial culture. So even though Shopify is a big company, what entrepreneurial lessons do you take away from the experience as you eventually go on to pursue other things?
Yeah, Shopify is awesome. And it almost sometimes feels like a cheat code being able to work at the company while I'm also doing work to like help build LISN, because you could learn from all of these things that they've done and have iterated on over time and kind of apply that to your own situation to see, not necessarily repeat the same mistakes if you don't need to. And similarly, like one of the things I was surprised by when I was joining Shopify, I joined kind of 3 years ago at this stage, was how much was still not completely figured out, right? And that was okay. Like you don't need to have a process for every single thing. At some point, like processes end up impeding you more than they end up helping enable you. And so being kind of okay with that at Shopify scale made me realize that that's not necessarily the right thing to be focused on, which begs the question, like, what is the right thing to be focused on? And I think with Shopify, it's really clear that it's the mission. they're a super mission driven company, right? And for them, that means being merchant obsessed, being entrepreneurially obsessed. There's all of this just positioning and beliefs that the world is better with more entrepreneurs in it. And how can we as a company work towards that future reality where more people are able to pursue their careers and as an entrepreneur, should they choose to? And so being able to all align behind like this one very clear and articulated mission, I think gets people like bought in, gets people excited, gets people passionate about the work that they're doing. And Shopify's nailed that piece. So it's always clear to us, like when we go to work, when we're working on these different projects, like what is the goal? And the goal is to help those merchants be as successful as we can be. And that comes with a bunch of other, I'd say, supporting values. Like Shopify has 6 of them that are all really sound. Things like building for the long term, considering what it's like to be a 100-year company versus just short-term financial gains, or being a constant learner, thriving on change when it's inevitable, right? Like chaos, everything we're seeing with the world right now. And then 2 others too is like being impactful. So how can you help as an individual make the greatest net positive contribution to the overall mission? And then lastly, it's like something that's more startup focused, which is like make great decisions quickly, right? So how can you act fast with the context that you have and do those things? But of all of those things, I think the big one is really being merchant obsessed, knowing what the mission is, believing in that mission and working towards it, because that's how you get everyone kind of on the same page and really able to produce fantastic results, which luckily we've been able to see over the last little while.
I believe in the coming decade, Shopify is probably going to be the biggest accelerator of future entrepreneurs in Canada, in the sense of not just the entrepreneurs who are the clients who use Shopify software, but in the sense of the former Shopify employees, the Shopify alumni, who are going to go on and create all of these different companies across the country and also invest in a ton of different companies. And I saw the launch of a angel fund led by called Backbone Angels, led by female Shopify executives, and I think that's just an example of just a piece of the broader puzzle of the extent to which Shopify alumni are really going to play a huge role in driving Canada's entrepreneurial potential, for the very reason Zameer talked about, which is that the working in a company like Shopify teaches someone so much about entrepreneurship and what it takes to build a company of that stature, that all these people are going to take these experiences and I think apply that to launching their own venture. And I think what you're doing, Zameer, is a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about.
100%. Yeah. And they really kind of like walk the talk when it comes to wanting to enable entrepreneurship, right? Like there's tons of employees within Shopify that have side hustles of different like e-com businesses or just other things that they are really supported in from their peers at work. And I think that kind of support in that community just allows people to show up to work way more authentically, way more driven, way more happy that the work that they're doing within Shopify is having other positive effects within their life. And I think that's awesome to see. So if there's like a takeaway there, it's just really being able to, as a company, articulate what your mission is and getting that buy-in from your people, because it goes a long way.
It is so important. And there's a great book called The Alliance by Reid Hoffman, where he talks about entrepreneurial companies in essence form alliance with their employees, which is to say that employees commit to working at that company for a few years, but it's with an understanding that the employees will eventually leave to go launch their own company or to take a more progressively senior role at another firm. And I think that some of the most successful entrepreneurs, they don't view the employees of the companies as people who will stay there forever, but it's really saying, I want you, you're an entrepreneurial person, you're 22, you're 23, you're 24. I'd love to give you this great learning opportunity, work in this company, and hopefully through this experience, you're set up to then go launch your own company, and potentially I'll actually invest in it, in the sense of different founders. So yeah, and interestingly, that was the story of with Salesforce. Mark Benioff, the founder of Salesforce, he was at Oracle for almost 10 years, and a lot of the initial capital that he got to launch Salesforce was actually from Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle. Many different stories like that, but I think your story rings true, and I think is great career advice for a lot of people who are looking to one day be entrepreneur. I think one of the most effective ways to train to be an entrepreneur and to eventually launch its own firm is to go work at a company like Shopify or a growing, scaling startup scale-up company.
100%. And even like closer to home, I think we see examples of this with the likes of Chris Grouchy and what he's been able to build with Convictional, having been like one of the very first sales reps at Shopify, and now creating his own YC-backed company as like a B2B platform. And so there's a lot of that where you could actually, you might have an idea and you might not necessarily know exactly how to approach it. But as you're figuring that out, you're not slowing down your learning, which is what's going on in this full-time role at a company where it's really showing you what the applied version of an idea looks like, and you could take those learnings and create your own. So yeah, no, it's a great blueprint, if you will, in a lot of cases.
On the topic of learning, what are 3 books that you recommend our listeners check out, and why do you recommend them?
I'll start with the one that I kind of read every single day. It's a non-traditional format of a book. It's called The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday, and it's effectively a collection of quotes from different Stoics through the times, with commentary about like the modern application of those quotes. And the reason I like it is because it's a very quick read. It takes like a minute or two to read in the morning or whenever you want throughout the day, and just is organized in various themes that help reinforce those ideas within your own life. And so it's really refreshing if you've never like kind of taken a look at stoicism before, just the perspective of how you have so much control over your overall experience of ultimately, even if these third party events happen to you, the results of how you feel are in your control. And a lot of that is something that somebody just got to read and to believe. The other two, one is I'm reading Obama's Promised Land right now, which is amazing. I'm actually listening to it, which is what I would recommend you do as well, because he orates the whole thing and it's 30 hours of just him talking to your ear, which is amazing. And the reason I like that one is because, I mean, Obama's just so intelligent and articulate, and just has such a humane perspective on topics where he's able to kind of convey both sides of an issue, and really allow you to feel like with empathy how the people involved in a situation might feel. So I really appreciate that part of it, as well as like the inner workings of politics, which you sometimes don't see. Like so much of it is contentious, unfortunately, and team oriented. And so getting insight into what that process is like, I think helps you kind of understand a little bit more about the challenges that we're facing in certain democracies. But my last one is Phil Knight's Shoe Dog. So that's the story of Nike, a memoir. It's fantastic. Definitely cried at the last chapter. So get some tissues out for that if you make it that far. But it effectively just kind of shows you how even a company as massive and successful as Nike just started as a hustle, right? Started as a really constant grind of, I'm just going to get my next sale order in. I'm just going to use all the credit that I have to kind of keep growing this business. And only through time and persistence was he able to create this empire that now Nike is, and this icon really around the world. So those 3 books are definitely ones that I think anyone would gain a lot from. So add it to your list if you have a reading list ongoing.
Those are great recommendations. I am a fan of all 3. I actually have not read The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday yet, but I have it on my bookshelf. So I'm actually going to take it out and I'm going to add it to my daily. I've started using this 5-minute journal. It's like a kind of gratitude journal. Do you use it as well, Zameer?
Yep. I got it right here. So I don't use it every day. My partner is definitely a lot more consistent with it than I have. There you go. It's amazing. But yeah, it is like a nice organized format on how to approach journaling.
Agreed. I like it as well, and just as a kind of a quick habit to do. And I think one of the other things that I'm going to actually add that to my list is to read one thing from the Daily Stoic each day, because I've had a lot of people recommend it, Stoicism, to me, and I think it is such an important philosophy, and there's a reason why it's been able to persist for thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks so much, Zameer. This has been a super interesting conversation. We have covered a really wide range of topics, everything from podcasting to Shopify's entrepreneurial culture, to your experiences in student government and running student government election campaigns, to how somebody can break into the software engineering or just general kind of engineering space. You have a ton of different interesting insights, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you since you were part of the 2018 Venture for Canada Fellow cohort. And I'm really excited to see what you do in terms of your next steps and to follow the growth and development of LISN. I think you're onto something really cool in this space, and definitely something that Venture for Canada might want to leverage at some point in terms of our podcast as well. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Zameer.
Scott, thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, would love to partner up in the future with Listen Clips and the FC at some point. All the best with everything that you folks are working on.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.